Reverend Jeremiah Geezer would be passing through town on his horse. And so we invited him to stop and have a bite to eat and share with us some of his experiences in ministry through the years. The Reverend Jeremiah T. Geezer is, well, okay, he's a fictitious character who gradually took on historical proportions in the imagination of one Don Gall over a period of years. While serving as the Iowa Conference minister from 1986 to 1994, Don would appear on stage each year at the annual meeting. If you've ever been to an annual meeting, you might see how that could lighten things up a bit. The annual meeting of the conference is the Reverend Jeremiah T. Geezer, much to the delight of the delegates assembled. Through this dramatic medium, Don brought to the people in the churches of the Iowa Conference a deepened appreciation of their history and the importance of the Iowa Congregational Home Missionary Society, which helped establish many of the early congregational churches in Iowa during the 1800s. Does anyone else here besides Kathy and me have Iowa connections? All right. So you probably know where some of those churches are. Although not an historical figure himself, Jeremiah T. Geezer is nevertheless a legendary character based on historical facts. The stories he tells, though perhaps a bit embellished from time to time, are true stories of actual events which helped shape the character and quality of frontier religion in America from the time of the Pilgrims to the eve of the 21st century. His talk today, before he comes out, he wanted us to sing a song, put our voices together in the spirit of the old-time church. And Dennis Lees is going to lead us on piano, and we are going to sing that old favorite hymn, What a Fellowship. What a fellowship we have here. After which we will welcome Reverend Jeremiah T. Geezer. Dennis, take it away.
I'm the Reverend Jeremiah Geezer, T as in Thomas. It's good to see you all. It's good to be here. You may think you don't look like an 18th century or 19th century missionary because I'm hip. I traded in my horse for a motorcycle. And you know those old frock coats? They kept getting tangled up in the chains. So I decided to come looking like this. Hope you don't mind. Thank you. Well, my journey actually began a long time ago, a long distance from here, almost 2 centuries ago, 3,000 miles from here. You may wonder, given how old I supposedly am, about my mental acumen or my physical stamina. But let me assure you that I'm fit as a fiddle, twice as ornery. And as I look about me, I'd say some of you are getting close to where my age is. Anyway, it's good to be here and to share with you a little bit out of our common history. Common history because you're all Congregationalists, and so am I. And the Congregational Church has a long history in this country, not as long as me. And I want to talk a little bit about the movement of the church across the frontier during those early years, up until the present, actually. My topic is Bible in hand, gun in pocket. Now, I've got the Bible, but I want to assure you I don't have a gun in my pocket. Actually, the guns back in my day were too big to put in your pocket. They were usually long guns or big Colt 45s. Most people in the early days had weapons like that for hunting, protection. Today, unfortunately, there are more guns in this country than there are people. And there are more people killed in the last 50 years by guns than have died in all of America's wars. You know that? You know that 70% of the people killed by guns in the state of Oregon were suicides? That's even more tragic, isn't it? Well, anyway, I didn't come here to talk about that. I came here really to talk about the movement of the church across this vast land. You know, when the people got off the Mayflower way back in 1620, they presumably had come to these shores for religious freedom. But the truth of the matter is that most of those people came looking for freedom. They weren't all that interested in religion. Of the 101 people on the Mayflower, only 12 were actually members of a church. The rest were people who were needed to help establish a new settlement. And they were not very interested in the church. Not more than 1 out of 5 of the Massachusetts Bay Colony during the early years was a member of the church. And as late as 1760, only 1 New Englander out of 8 belonged to the church. 1 out of 15 in the middle colonies. 1 out of 20 in the south. By 1800, an estimated 7% of the entire American population was churched. Now, if you don't believe that, check it out. The eminent church historian William Warren Sweet gives those facts in his books. There came to be a time when more unchurched people were in America than in any other country in Christendom, in proportion to the total population. Well into the 19th century, traveling preachers continued to be astounded by the lack of religion on the frontier. One preacher I heard of told of approaching a man on his farm, and by way of attempting to engage him in conversation, asked him if he knew Jesus Christ. The man said, "No. Oh, Levi, I know that gentleman." The preacher thought that he must have misunderstood, so he asked him again. He said, "Sir," rather indignantly, "Sir, I'm telling you the truth. I don't know the man. He must not live in these parts." Another preacher told of asking a woman in her home if she had any religious conviction. She said, "Nope. Nope. My old man neither. He was arrested for horse stealing once," she said, "but he weren't never convicted." And then there's the story about a Presbyterian missionary who arrived at a house or a cabin in the woods. He asked the woman at the door if there were any Presbyterians around. She acknowledged that she wasn't sure if there were or not. But she said, "If you really want to know, you might go around back and check the pelts that my husband tacks up on the back wall. If there are any Presbyterians around, he's bound to have caught one by now." Well, one of the great myths that we've always enjoyed is that religion was such an important part of the founding of our nation. But it was extremely slow in crossing the land. One of the reasons for that was undoubtedly the brutal difficulty that people had in just staying alive. The hostile resistance of native peoples, the weather, the hardships that went with frontier living. They had all they could do just to keep body and soul together on this earth without worrying about preparing for the next world. Just as common folks took political matters into their own hands, so they also took their religious matters into their own hands. And it was usually from the ranks of these common folk that a prominent preacher was called into service. Now, the typical frontier preacher was really unlearned, which was not considered a handicap, since most congregations usually bragged about the humbleness and ignorance of their ministers. In fact, much of the frontier was hostile to learning, book learning. Frontier people were in the main feelers, not thinkers. And they held that religion was caught, not taught. Well, preparation of sermons, therefore, was usually left to the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, which was acquired at the time of delivery. And failure to speak extemporaneously was usually viewed as evidence that the speaker had not been properly born again. The few preachers who did graduate from college often found it difficult to communicate with their earthbound congregants. One young graduate, after delivering his first sermon, asked the pillar of the church what he thought of it. "Well," said the pillar of the church, "as I see it, there were 3 faults. First, you read it. Secondly, you read it poorly. And thirdly, it wasn't worth reading in the first place." Now, not all would-be preachers, educated or not, even found it easy to get a job on the frontier. One instance, a church almost split over the question of whether or not the young man before them was really fit to be in the ministry. So the young graduate proceeded to explain to the brethren gathered that he had spent many hours in earnest prayer with the Lord, asking for a vision, for a direction as to what he should do with his life. And after his long period of prayer and supplication, there appeared in the sky 3 flaming letters, GPC, which the young man interpreted to mean, "Go preach Christ." Well, after having divulged the content of his revelation, an old deacon stood up at the back of the meeting hall, and he said, "Brethren, I do not doubt that this young man had a vision. And I do not question that he saw 3 flaming letters in the heavens. I don't even doubt that that came from God himself. But knowing this young man as I do, I must conclude that he misread the vision. GPC could only have stood for Go Pick Cotton." Well, frontier ministers endured probably greater hardships than most other people. They lived among their people, they worked hard, they often rode long distances. There were perhaps none who suffered more than the Methodist circuit riders. In truth, we Congregationalists, we found our place more among the settlers than among the pioneers. We were more inclined to move into an area after it was settled, set up a Sunday school for the children, then convene a prayer meeting for the parents, and eventually build a meeting house in which to hold worship services on a regular basis. So if it hadn't been for the Methodist circuit riders, the spread of religion on the frontier would have been a lot slower than it actually was. One Methodist preacher by the name of Horace Bishop told of making the rounds of his circuit. He said, "I preached 28 times a month," which was laundry day in the country. My wardrobe was one end of my saddlebags, my library was the other. My study was the shade of a tree where there was ample grass for my horse. I slept on the ground atop my Mexican blanket. Despite the obvious ways in which these people struggled and found their calling and then exercised that which they felt called to do, there still was time in which you would find between the Methodists and the Baptists and the Presbyterians this kind of denominational rivalry of which we know nothing today, right? The lack of learning and common cultural interest tended to breed a kind of mental narrowness of mind and partisanship. Many of the frontier people believed that there was only one route to the glory land, and that their preacher had the only correct roadmap. Sometimes that rivalry was laced with good humor, as in the case of one preacher who applied for lodging at a tavern one night. The proprietor said to him, "Stranger, I perceive that you are a clergyman. Are you a Baptist or are you a Methodist?" "Why do you want to know?" asked the traveler. "Well, because I wish to please my guests," said the proprietor. "And I have observed that Baptists are very particular about their own food and bed, and that Methodists are very concerned about the care and feed of their horses." "Ah," said the traveler, "in that case, I'm a Baptist, my horse is a Methodist." On another occasion, a member of a Baptist church was given a litter of pups by his Methodist neighbor. Before he could leave with the pups, the Methodist circuit rider passed by and jokingly said, "What denomination are those pups?" Well, the Baptist, not wishing to offend his Methodist neighbor who had given him the pups, said, "They're Methodist pups." Well, a couple of weeks later, the circuit rider passed by the Baptist place, and he saw those same pups playing in the yard. So, in a rather joking way, he asked the Baptist again, what are the denomination of all those pups?" This time the Baptist said, "They're Baptist dogs." And the circuit rider said, "But 2 weeks ago you told me they were Methodist." The Baptist said, "Yeah, but that was before they had their eyes open." Well, the continuous bickering and taking pot shots at each other raised the question among some impartial observers that the church was rife with inconsistencies and hypocrisy, causing one idealist to sum it up this way. He said, "If we could get religion like a Baptist, experience it like a Methodist, understand it like a Congregationalist, be positive about it like the disciples, proud of it like an Episcopalian, pay for it like a Presbyterian, propagate it like an Adventist, and enjoy it like an African American, I'd join." I think I would too. Now, talking about all of these things behooves me also to mention the darker side. Because not all preachers on the frontier met the moral standards expected of them by their congregations. Some were guilty of hypocrisy or gambling or refusing to pay debts or just other forms of worldliness. And others were just plain bad men with a religious bent. Among the most notable bad men who also preached were John Wesley Hardin, Clay Addison, Jesse James, Cole Younger, just to name a few. John Wesley Hardin and Jesse James were both preachers' kids. And Cole Younger was said to have been a deeply religious man who probably would have become a minister if it hadn't been for the Civil War, which changed everything. Hardin, who was reputed to have killed numerous men with his pistols, would often set up church in a bar, placing his guns on the bar. He would invite his fellow revelers to gather with him, and then he would preach one of his hell and brimfire sermons. And somewhere during the middle of his sermon, he would stop and ask his listeners whether they agreed with him or not. If so, to raise their hands. They all did. For those guns of Hardin's were always in view. Well, many a bad man became an exemplary Sunday school teacher while in prison. Some were known to have quoted scripture on their way to the gallows. But none of them ever organized a church or established a college or left any kind of religious legacy behind. They were simply bad men who had a bent for religion. They were exemplars of those who carried a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. On the frontier, a preacher who could only talk soon found himself without a job, because as a preacher you got to do more than talk, you got to communicate. It was into such an environment that people like me and the educated Congregationalists from the East came hoping to establish a new religious order within a less than intellectual environment. I was one of a dozen students from Andover Seminary near Boston who eventually heard the call to go west and establish churches on the new frontier. We had gathered in a darkened corner of the Andover Library one night during a vicious storm, and we prayed for a vision that would tell us where the Lord wanted us to go. Little did we know at the time that we would all go down in history as the band of home missionaries that carried the gospel across the Mississippi to the far reaches of the western frontier. About the same time our band was forming at Andover in 1853, a member of our group suggested that if each of us could plant one permanent church, that's lovely music, that if each one of us could plant one permanent church, and if all of us together could establish one college, what a grand undertaking that would be. Well, within a year of our arrival on the mission fields in Iowa, an academy was established. And by 1848, the first college west of the Mississippi opens its doors with one professor and two students, both of whom went on to become congregational missionaries. That academy continues to exist today under the name of Grinnell College, one of the finest liberal arts schools in the country.
And the wealthiest. Wealthiest.
Yes, very successful school. Other schools established were Doane College in Crete, Nebraska, Yankton College in South Dakota, and other centers of learning across the plains. The movement of the church, particularly the Congregational Church, left in its wake churches, colleges, halfway houses. Following the Civil War, the American Home Missionary Society of the Congregational Church established over 500 academies to teach and train freed blacks, former slaves. There were hospitals, all kinds of human services established in the name of the church. It was a time of great influence as the church moved, even at its minuscule pace, from shore to shore. In 1853, the American Home Missionary Society sent Thomas Condon from New York to the Willamette Valley here in Oregon, where in 1876 he was appointed to the University of Oregon's faculty as the state's first and only geologist. Condon was a member of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church at the time, and in 1889 was instrumental in helping to organize this church, First Congregational, of which he also became a charter member, and then became known throughout the state for his lectures on geology and for his reconciliation of the Bible and science. By 1885, a group of New School Presbyterians and Congregationalists further to the south established the College of California, which in 1868 was presented to the state of California to become the nucleus of what is now the University of California, Berkeley. Education, along with religion, had come to the frontier, and more people began to come, if not for themselves, then for their children and their grandchildren. Well, it's been a long journey from New England to Oregon, but then I guess it all got started a long time before that, and a lot further away. But the real beginning of this story is one that began in Bethlehem of Judea in the first century. And the real catalyst for all that has happened since was the man named Jesus. The footsteps of such a one, my countenance and the contributions count for little. May it only be said of me and of those with whom I have sojourned these many years that we did the best we could to advance his way across the early frontier continent. May God forgive all that we have left undone. And may that which we did help inspire others to carry it forward to some yet unknown and distant point in time. Now before I rev up my Harley and head on down the road, I want to invite you to join me in singing another one of those wonderful songs, The Other Side of the Mountain. Tempted and tried, we're off left to wonder why it must be this all the day long when there are others living about us, never molested, though in the wrong. Well, farther along, you'll know all about it. Let's sing it together, Dennis.